So the IRS is sending out requests for information for taxpayers to provide information about the ERC, about why they claim the ERC, and the analysis that the employer went through when determining that they were indeed eligible employers for the purposes of the ERC. So I wanted to take this opportunity to walk through Notice 2021-20 and specifically the substantiation requirements that the IRS lists in these notices. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So question 70 on Notice 2021-20 goes into all the substantiation requirements related to the ERC. And this is one of those things that a lot of folks unfortunately overlooked during the initial filing of the employee retention credit. This is actually at the very end of the notice. It's page 100 of 102 of this notice. The question goes through, well, what records should an employer maintain to substantiate their eligibility for the purposes of the employee retention credit? The government goes through and gives a list of records that are going to want to see, and it's the taxpayer's responsibility to retain. First and foremost is any documentation to show how the employer determined it was indeed eligible, including specifically, number one, you got to have the government orders, the actual government on orders that you relied upon that resulted in the suspension of your business operations. So if you're relying on a partial suspension argument, a full or partial suspension, you have to have that government order. And generally, what the IRS is asking for, not only just the government order, but highlighting the specific portions of that order that were applicable to your business. So number one is make sure you have the actual government orders saved in the PDF. The IRS doesn't like links. They want to see the actual PDF documents. Number two is any records that you relied upon to determine whether more than a nominal portion of your operations were suspended or whether government orders had more than a nominal effect on your operations. So this is actually a really interesting part of the notice. So there's a lot of conversation about within those 2021-20 about, well, what is more than a nominal portion of operations? Interestingly enough, there's not much discussion on a nominal effect on operations, but clearly these are two separate ideas. So throughout Notice 2021-20, the idea of nominal comes up, and nominal generally within this notice goes back to this 10% standard. A nominal portion of operations is considered 10% of your gross receipts or 10% of your employee work hours. So that would be more than a nominal portion. But a nominal effect, in fact, there's no other discussion of nominal effect on business operations. When you're determining whether or not a government order had more than a nominal effect on your operations, it's fair to assume, can you point to more than a 10% effect on your operations? And if you go back to those early portions of what is a partial suspension, I've done other videos on this. Remember that a partial suspension is a government mandate that results in a reduction of an employer's ability to provide goods and services in ordinary course. And so if we use ability and look at that effect, we might be able to make the same argument that a nominal effect would be a 10% impact on your operation. That's I think the most interesting part of number 70 is the fact that we're talking about more than a nominal portion or more than a nominal effect on operations. Third one, any records that you're using to determine if you had a significant decline in gross receipts. Generally speaking, that's at minimum your profit and loss statement. And generally, if you're relying on the decrease in gross receipts, you're going to have your P&L with supporting documentation as well to substantiate your profit and loss. Any employees that received qualified wages, right? So these are going to be generally your payroll records, which employees who got paid, when they got paid, how much they got paid. So your payroll records would identify the employee and the amount of wages that they were paid, and of those wages that were paid, how much of those wages were qualified for the purposes of the credit. If you happen to be a large eligible employer, you have to be able to demonstrate that the wages paid during this time, the employee was not providing services. So effectively, they were furloughed during this time period. So if you're a large eligible employer, different criteria for what is and is not qualified wages. Additionally, if you are seeking reimbursement, if you're using your health plan expenses to calculate the employee retention credit, you have to document that as well. And then this is another one that was commonly overlooked, was the aggregation analysis, whether or not the employer is part of a larger aggregated group. So I have a longer video on what an aggregated group is, but generally speaking, the ERC was a small business tax credit. The aggregation rules are there to ensure that businesses don't try to be small, don't try and pretend to be small just by nature of having a bunch of different legal entities to look small when they're really a much larger organization. So there's very specific aggregation rules that you have to go through. And when you're part of a large organization, you have to combine all the different entities. If you happen to file Form 7200, very few folks did, but back in 2020, 2021, there was an opportunity to request it in advance of the ERC before you file your payroll taxes. That Form 7200, you need to have that on file. Not many people did that, but if you did do that, you want to make sure you have that on file. And then any completed employment tax returns that you submit to the IRS, right? So whether you amended your returns and or just your original returns, so you want your 941s and your 941Xs on the hand. And if you happen to use a PEO or payroll employment organization, you want to have your records that you provided them as well. Your PEOs are asking for a lot of the same type of expense as well. So hopefully that's helpful. This is a really good opportunity to go back and look at your documentation, ensure that you have all this on file. And if you don't have it, now's the time to get it. Start looking around for it, compiling that information. Hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks.